Welcome, friends, to the program of Asha and Ganga Jamni Heritage. Uh, Today we have Professor Catherine Asher. Professor Asher is in no need of an introduction. She teaches at Department of Art History at the University of Minnesota. If ever you want to understand the architecture of medieval India, you just cannot ignore her. She is the author of around 9 books. Of these, 2 are extremely popular and, should I say, a must read. For example, The Architecture of Mughal India, which she wrote in 1992. And then the second work, which is extremely important as far as I am concerned, India Before Europe, which she did along with Cynthia Talbot in 2006. Professor Asher just told me that she is going to come out with a revised version of this book. One of her earlier books was Perceptions of South Asia's Visual Past, which was written down in 1994. Another of her publications, which I would like to name, is Mapping Hindu-Muslim Identities Through the Architecture of Shahjahanabad and Jaipur, which was published in 2000. Her latest edited book is Delhi's Qutub Complex, the Minar, Mosque, and Mehrauli, which she wrote for the Mark in 2017. She is also the author of a large number of research papers and articles, of which I would like to name only 1 or 2. The first, which I would like to name, is The Mausoleum of Sher Shah Sur, which was published in Artibus Asiae in 1977. Another of her essays, which impacted me a lot, is Multiple Memories, Lives of the Taj Mahal in Crossing Cultures, Conflict, Migration, Convergence, done in 2008. One of the remarkable features of her work on architecture has been her emphasis on sub-imperial architecture. Unlike other scholars of architectural history, her works emphasize the architectural endeavors of the nobility, which are in fact introduced through her works. From that of Raja Man Singh from Bengal to Vrindavan to Jaipur, to the architectural feats of the Jains in Delhi and Jaipur. Professor Asher is also the recipient of a number of awards. 2 of them are McKnight Research Award and Richard W. Hanke Alumni Teacher Award from Lake Forest College. I have had the honor of meeting her way back in December 2006 or 2007 at India International Center at Delhi, when she offered me, probably, I don't know whether she remembers it or not, a very hearty meal, as well as she presented me her India Before Europe. I'm really thankful to you, ma'am, for that. Later on, I had the honor of having hosted her at the Department of History, AMU, in 2008, where she delivered 2 very beautiful lectures. I invite Professor Asher to come and deliver her lecture which deals with the contributions of the nobility as far as architecture in India under the Mughals is concerned. Professor Asher.
Thank you. I think I'm on now. Can everybody see my PowerPoint? Is it visible? Okay. Good morning from the United States. Good evening to you in India. I just want to make a small comment, and that was, excuse me, yesterday we had a very exciting event in the United States where finally, after 4 years of rancor and hostility, we are now going to have the opportunity, especially under Vice President Kamala Harris, to share our heritage again. That's my little teeny introduction to my presentation today on shared heritages, because I like to think of multiple ones. Patronage by the nobility under Akbar. Why don't we start off by just very quickly thinking about architecture under Akbar. Certainly, the earliest material, his earliest project, Humayun's tomb, completed in 1571, with which I'm sure you're all familiar, is very much in the Timurid tradition. What we're seeing here right now on the bottom part of the screen is a uncompleted Timurid tomb, but I think you can get the idea. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we have a lot of material, that the overall shape and that Timurid tomb would have had a double dome, would have been the type of prototype that we would have had for Humayun's tomb. The plan also, the interior plan on the left, which is a 8 paradise plan, quite complex, certainly a departure from the single chambers that we had of earlier Indian tombs, is modeled again on Timurid types, as you see here on the right. But the red sandstone with the white marble trim, which we of course know is the dominant overall appearance of the tomb, is certainly modeled on earlier Indian prototypes. The initial one would, of course, been the 1311 Alai Darwaza, and more contemporary would have been the mosque in the Purana Kila. So in other words, what we're seeing with the fabric, the exterior fabric of Humayun's tomb, is sharing an Indian heritage, while the interior and the overall plan is reminiscent of the Mughals' Timurid heritage. And again, I just show you the overall image if you've somehow magically forgotten what Humayun's tomb looks like. Now, if we think about the architecture that he does a little later, for example, material at Fatehpur Sikri, that material very much is less Timurid, but is very much in what I call a pan-Indian style. For example, I'm showing you a detail on the left from Fatehpur Sikri, and you're seeing here a detail from the Gwalior Palace of Man Singh Tomar. Now, many people have mistakenly thought of Akbar's architecture as borrowing from Hindu traditions. It's not borrowing from Hindu traditions. It's borrowing from pan-Indian traditions. For example, I'm showing you here a detail of the entrance to the mosque complex at Lodi Gardens, more properly known as the Bagh Jude, where you can see the post and lintel type entrance, which is similar to what we just saw at Fatehpur Sikri and at, the Gwalior Palace. Now, if we just leap back over to, again, Fatehpur Sikri, and think of Akbar's Jharoka, where he presents himself to his public, we can see that it's been constructed in what I'm going to call an Indic style. That is, it is all post and lintel construction, no arches in this. And here I'm showing you a detail, and I'm showing you a painting from the Victorian Albert Akbarnama, which most people believe is the version that was actually presented to Akbar himself. And you can see Akbar peeking out of his window and how he's being presented to his subjects. Now here, of course, what we have is a conflation of Indic ideas, the idea of the Jaroka, the darshan, derived from Hindu practice, but also the Muslim, or I should say the Islamic idea, which we find in adab texts that have been written since at least the 10th century, that it is the ruler's obligation to make himself accessible to his public. So even in this practice, we see two traditions that are being fused, the heritage that have been shared and fused together. This, of course, leads us to the fact that Akbar was engaged in religious discussions in his Ibadat Khana, which ultimately, I know I'm sort of doing this fast, but I'm trying to get to the nobles, which ultimately takes us to the idea of Suleku. That is this idea of universal toleration, of peace to all, however you want to think of it and translate it into English. So this becomes the basis for Akbar's political thought and the way that he presents himself. In about 1585 or so, after Akbar departs from Fatehpur Sikri, and he no longer really is engaged in architectural construction. Until now, he had built a number of forts, he had built palaces, he had built his father's tomb. And at this point, he basically gives the responsibility of architectural construction to the nobility. Certainly, we see this very easily in the case of Ajmer, where he has nobles building the city walls, the gates, and so on and so forth. While Akbar never does this officially, well, he never actually has an order that says that the nobles should be responsible for construction. His successor, Jahangir, in the second of his 12 regnal orders when he ascends the throne, basically officially says that it is the obligation of the nobles to build in the hinterlands and to make sure that there is sort of civilization that's expanded throughout the land. What we find is that in some of the earliest construction are nobles who had been originally associated with Bairam Khan. Bairam Khan wasn't he did build a mansion and a few things, none of which are extant. But certainly Bairam Khan was a major figure, as we know. And just to remind you, I'm showing you two paintings from various Akbarnamas, which remind us of his role. Nobles who had served under Bairam Khan, especially under Bairam Khan when he was serving under Humayun, included Munim Khan, who had been one of the major nobles of Humayun. Once after Humayun died, after Akbar comes to the throne, and once Akbar dispatches Bairam Khan, who is the father of Abdur Rahim, who will figure in this talk too. We have Munim Khan, who becomes the Khane Kanan, in other words, the head of the nobles, a role which he maintains until his death in 1575. And here we have a page again from the Akbarnama showing him subduing rebels. The reason I'm showing these illustrations is to remind us that these are notable figures who are included in this official history, just to remind us of that. Now, Munim Khan was also Akbar's governor of Jaunpur, which I forgot to write on the screen, but that's okay, which was then basically the easternmost province of the Mughal Empire, from about, and he was there, he was in control for a pretty long period of time, given the idea that nobles are shifted every 2 years. Then in the cases of many of these patrons, in fact, they are not. From 1567 to 75, he was essentially in charge of Jaunpur. He adds this gate to an older Tughlaq fort. And inside of this fort, he builds both a palace, which no longer survives, and a bath, a hammam. We do, however, have a lithograph from William Hodges, a late 18th century work, excuse me, that gives us an idea of what this palace may have looked like. And if you look at sort of the top front projecting area of the illustration, you see that on the top, there's a little domed pavilion. So we can see that the style of this palace, of which we don't see much of, but we see a little bit here, is built in the Akbari tradition. We can see that much here as we look. The hammam, which I'm showing you in the exterior, of course, these were once all over the Mughal countryside and in the cities, many in the cities. Some survive at Fatehpur Sikri, other hammams survive, excuse me, in various caravanserais, especially in the Punjab from slightly later periods. And this, of course, would have been for imperial, or for the governor's use and his retinue, since it was inside the fort. Just to give you an idea of what they look like, since maybe not all of you have seen these kinds of structures. Although the hammam would have been for the use of the elite, Muin Khan is also credited with building or repairing a number of bridges in the vicinity of Jaunpur. Only one of these bridges survives, which I'll show you in a minute. This is not his bridge, but it's a typical example of a Mughal bridge, just to give you an idea of what a pretty average Mughal bridge might look like. The most important bridge that he built, his most important project, was the bridge that you're seeing here in Jaunpur, which he built, of course, to serve the public, but also to preserve his name, since he had no heirs. This was built in pretty early in Akbar's period, between 1564 and 68, by an engineer who either was from Kabul itself, as his name suggests, or was descended from someone who was originally from Kabul. Munim Khan claimed, or proclaimed, I should say, that it was better to build public works rather than religious ones. This bridge today is known as the Shahi Bridge, suggesting that Akbar had built it, but inscriptions on it indicate that it was built by Munim Khan. There are many stories associated with this bridge. And one of them is that there was an old woman who couldn't cross the river because there was no bridge, and Akbar ordered it to be built. Now, this story, I suspect, has got a grain of truth, but it seems a little bit more apocryphal to me. But it seems to me that the story comes out of the tradition of texts such as Nizam al-Mulk's Book of Government, the Siyasat-Nama, where it's important for the ruler or those serving under him to provide for the public's welfare. So it seems to me that this is coming out of a tradition of basically the public good. And probably it's possible that Muin Khan built this on Akbar's order, but it's clear that he chose to spend his money in this way. This bridge impressed the British, which didn't usually happen. Rudyard Kipling wrote a very long poem on its honor. And in the 19th century, there was a massive storm and flood, which destroyed a huge amount of material around the Gomti River, which this bridge is over. But the bridge remained intact, thereby earning the praise of the British. It was a subject of illustration. You can see this is an illustration, I think by Hodges, if I remember correctly, showing the bridge. And here, I'm sorry, this is an official photograph. But you can see that the bridge is not just a bridge, but it has these kiosks, these chhatris over it that would serve as a place to protect the traveler from sun, or perhaps a place to enjoy the cooling bridges. I'm sorry, the airs. It's a little early in the morning for me. Forgive me. Now, this bridge, as we know, was built in the 1560s. And later, I'd say about at least 40 years later, a bridge similar to this is built in Isfahan under Shah Abbas. And I often wonder if somehow he hadn't heard about this bridge, the Jaunpur Bridge, and was inspired to build a similar one in the great city of Isfahan. Now, another noble who has our attention is Shah Quli Khan. Shah Quli Khan was instrumental in the defeat of Himu. And what we have here on the screen is a page from an Akbarnama, not the one in the Victoria and Albert. This is another page from another Akbarnama. It doesn't show Shah Quli Khan capturing Himu, but this would have been a double-page composition, and the main page is simply missing. My point here, again, is to show that Shah Quli Khan, who is much less known than Munim Khan, was still an instrumental figure in the sort of foundation of the early years of Humayun's and Akbar's reign. He rose to a high rank in Akbar's court after his involvement with capturing Himu, who, as we know, has served the Surs and claimed the throne. He held land in Narnaul, where he built an enormous estate. And this estate included a pleasure pavilion, which was originally set in water, today called the Jal Mahal, and that's what you're looking at here, and his own tomb complex. And this, again, shows that he held this land for a very long period of time. This was all built between 1574 and 88. So again, this notion that nobles were always shifted every 2 years is certainly called into question here. Now, if we think about this Jal Mahal, where what you're seeing here, which is green, would have been completely full of water. And so this would have resided in the middle of basically an artificial tank, an artificial pool. The inspiration for this sort of tank may have come from several sources. Certainly we know that Sher Shah's tomb was the first of any major tomb in India to be set in a pool of water. I suspect, and I don't want to get into this because I don't have time, but that as many of you may know, the tomb is not aligned with the plinth. My guess is that the plinth was pre-existing, and that originally possibly a pleasure pavilion originally sat on that plinth before the tomb was built. Not So far from Narnaul are the temples at Baroli, which also are set in water. And you can see here on the right, not much water is there when I took this picture last year, but this again would have originally completely been filled with water. I have seen it at times when it is. So it's possible again that we're seeing with the Jal Mahal at Narnaul, ideas derived from Hindu traditions and from Indo-Islamic ones that are being, as we might say, shared in this pleasure pavilion at Narnaul. If we look at just the top of the pavilion, we can see that it compares favorably with architecture at Fatehpur Sikri. That is, we can see that the very famous Khas Mahal here, Diwani Khas, sorry, its shape and overall plan looks very much like Shah Quli Khan's Jal Mahal. However, the interior, as you can see, I can actually not see my screen because the sun is so bright, but the interior is much more Timurid in effect. So again, we have this conflation, these sharing of traditions in a single structure. And here I'm just showing you a detail of a Timurid structure and the interior again of Shah Quli Khan's Jal Mahal to give you an idea of how this is extremely Timurid in appearance. Now, the complex has this very large entrance gate, which I admit visually isn't too exciting, but I'm showing it to you really just to give you an idea of how large this estate must have been. Today, it's basically all agricultural land. He also, oh, I guess I went the wrong way. He also built his own tomb, which you can see here. And the tomb is basically an octagonal tomb. And it reminds us of, for example, the the library at the Purana Qila, which we know had been built by Humayun when he returned from Kabul, from Iran. And you see an octagonal structure. We see the Sabz Burj in Delhi, of course, again, a Timurid type building. But if we look at the red or pink really and gray facade of the tomb, we can see that it is borrowing from local traditions. And what you're seeing in the lower left-hand corner is the tomb that Sher Shah built for his grandfather in Narnaul, where you can see that they both are using the local stone, pink and this gray stone. And this pink and gray stone is really pretty much unique to Narnaul. I've never really seen it anywhere. So we have a fusion here of local traditions, of Timurid traditions, of Indic traditions in this complex at Narnaul. The interior, with its pure white marble, is very much reminiscent of what we see of the interior of the tomb of Hussein Shah in Mandu. So again, we have these multiple traditions that are being conflated in this single structure and really giving us a kind of pan-Indian vision in a single complex. When Shah Quli Khan died in 1601, he had a garden that he had built in Agra. And that garden reverted to the state as he had no heirs. And it was given to Akbar's wife. But before he even died, knowing that all his money would go to the state, he very cleverly distributed it to charity. And again, this is the sort of patronage that we might find. Now, of the people that I'm talking about, Abdul Rahim Khani Kanan is probably much better known than the two men I had just discussed. He has an outstanding career, as we know, under both Akbar and Jahangir. And we have two portraits of him on the screen. There's a number of portraits of the Khane-Kanan that survive, again, giving us an idea of his significance in the court. And of course, he rises to the highest level, being the head of all the nobles. We know that the young Abdurrahim was, whose father was Bahram Khan, was taken into royal protection after his father's assassination in 1561. This is again included in the Victoria and Albert V&A painting that you see on the right-hand side. Abdurrahim has an impressive career as a cultural patron. We know that he was a huge patron of the Persian language, which of course, remember, Akbar was really pressing because he saw it as a language associated with Sulaykul, that is, a language which was not a language of religion, not Sanskrit, not Arabic, something that anyone could learn. He also patronized vernacular poets. He had a massive library, and he had a biography that was written by a notable scholar. He built a tomb for himself and his wife in Delhi. And the tomb is not in, it's being restored, I understand, by the Aga Khan. But if we look, a foundation, not the Aga Khan personally. If we look at the tomb, we can see that it once had the red sandstone with white marble. That becomes obviously the sort of traditional Mughal facade associated very much first with Akbar and then the later Mughals. If we look at the tomb, we can see that it borrows both from the traditions of Humayun's tomb, but also of earlier tombs. Like Humayun's tomb, it sits on an arched plinth, as you can see here. But like the tombs of earlier elite Lodis and Sewers, it's a square plant tomb. That is the kind of tomb that was built for the nobles. In the decoration on what survives, and it's been stripped, as you can see, if you look at the spandrels of the arch, and the spandrels of the arch are those areas that just before the point of the arch, you can see that there is a star-like design, which of course we also see on Humayun's tomb. But I would like to point out to you that this is not unique to Humayun's tomb as many people think, but as, for example, the same sorts of stars are found on the tomb of Ibrahim Sur, that is Sher Shah's grandfather, in Narnaul, and on Lodi structures as well. So again, this kind of motif is Mughal, but also belongs to a larger Indic tradition. The Khane-Kanan's tomb is somewhat unique in that those little circular spandrels that we saw, while the stellate ones are fairly common, some of them are very unusual. For example, the one that I'm showing you here, which has a kind of, I don't know what, swirling design with this flower in the middle, is not found anywhere else. So there are fairly unique features to this tomb. The interior, which has just been restored by the Aga Khan Foundation, again, is extremely Timurid, as you can see in this illustration. So this tomb, again, like the one that we saw for Shah Quli Khan, but in a rather different way, combines or shares both Indic and Timurid traditions. I'm sure you all know that the Khane-Kanan wrote poetry under the name of Rahim. I'm sadly giving you the English translations. I'm sure that you'd be better off with the Hindi original. but he's very famous for his poetry. And as I said earlier, he was an enormous patron of poets, and he was a bibliophile. Of his collection of works, we see quite a range. One is the manuscript, luckily still intact, of one of the great poems by the Timurid poet Jami that had been scribed or calligraphed in about 1520 in Herat. Then, under the Khan Kanan, who acquired the calligraphy, he refurbished the manuscript and added these exquisite margins that you see here. That is the areas with the beautiful simorgs and the floral designs. In other words, we have a Persian text by a Timurid Sufi poet, and appropriately, the kind of marginalia that's added is in sync with the text. Another page from his great manuscript, the colophon page, that is the page that gives us historical information that tells us that the name of the calligrapher in the early 16th century was Sultan Ali Mashhadi, and that it was made in the city of Herat. Then we learn that the borders and the paintings was done almost 100 years later in 1606-7 by an artist by the name of Mushfiq. And again, what we have is a very Persianate picture, but the illustration added has a very Mughal style charbagh in it. In other words, it's giving us an Indian, a Mughal Indian, and a Timurid aspects together. So far, what we've seen is something that is basically a sort of Persianate in style. But we also know, just going back, that Akbar, in part of his policy of Sulay-Kul, had the Sanskrit classic texts translated into Persian and then illustrated. We know that. That's very common knowledge. And these are 2 pages from Akbar's very famous Ramayana, which is unfortunately under litigation in Jaipur, so we can't actually see it. We know that a number of people had copies of these, and there must have been many nobles who had them, because there's so many pages that survive, but unfortunately not intact in the manuscripts. One of these very high-ranking people was Akbar's mother, who owned a Ramayana, and these are 2 pages of her Ramayana. The Khan Kanan then asked permission to also have a copy of a Ramayana made, which took a very long period of time. It was completed in 1605, but it did have 165 illustrations. So obviously that would take some time. The Khan Kanan's Ramayana is pretty delightful. If you look at some of the images here, there will be Hanuman sort of carrying this great mountain, as you can see on the painting on the right-hand side. It's not the highest quality, but I don't think that really matters. What matters is that we have here the Khan Kanan being the conveyor of Akbar's message of Sulay-Kul. In other words, he is emulating Akbar's political message. He is sort of promoting this policy by having his own manuscript made. He also had a Razamnama, that is a Persian translation of the Mahabharata, done as well, of which I show you a single page here. So I'm saying that by engaging not only with the patronage of Persian poets, and Persian type manuscripts, but also by engaging in things that are more Indic in tradition, that he is, again, a sort of sharing in Akbar's promotion of the policy of Sulaykul. What's even more interesting to some extent is the fact that these 2 pages that I'm showing you here are both pages from a Ragamala manuscripts. The one on the left is a Ragamala that was commissioned by the Raja of Bikaner, while the one on the right is a Ragamala that was commissioned by Abdul Rahim Kane Kanan. Well, first of all, it seems quite amazing that the Kane Kanan would be so interested in a Ragamala. And some people had really wondered if that was the case. But if you look, you can see that the compositions, they are not identical, but they are extremely similar, especially in the case of the female figures. Now, it was discovered that a pounce, and a pounce is what I'm showing you in the middle of the 2 pictures here. And for those of you who don't know what a pounce is either a piece of paper or, more likely in this case, a piece of vellum, that is a piece of burnished leather, where an illustration is made, a sketch is made, and then little teeny holes are pricked into pricked in the outline of the design. Then the pounce is put on a piece of paper. Some charcoal dust is dusted over it. And so when the pounce is removed, you see an outline which then can be the basis of the composition. The work of Molly Aitken shows us that this particular Ragamala, known as the Loud Ragamala, shows that a manuscript of subject matter that's usually considered to be of not great interest to a Muslim patron is the result of cultural discourse among elite friends. We know that an appreciation of music showed cultivated taste. And Ragamalas were especially important for men to cool their senses. It turns out that the owner of the pounces used to produce both of these manuscripts was the Bikaner Raja, who served with the Kane Kanan in the Deccan, later under Jahangir, and he lent the pounces to the Kane Kanan so that he could make his own manuscript. But again, I would argue that the very fact that he is interested in this manuscript is a reflection truly of shared heritages, of friendships, of something that we don't usually think about. And this, I think, is a very important discovery on Molly's part. Now, we know that when Ranthambore was defeated by Akbar, that Surjan Singh Bundi submitted unhappily. He then was reinstated in the Mughal court, and he served Akbar at Chunar. And he also then retired to Banaras, where he built an estate. We see the Akbarnama painting of him submitting to Akbar. And what I'm showing you here on the right, and you're wondering what this is, I'm sure, is the only part that survives of his estate in Banaras in Varanasi. That is the wall of his estate that sat on the Ganges River. We know that he gave a great deal of money to temples. We don't think he actually built a temple, but we think that he certainly promoted Brahmins, and that he, as the work of Cindy Talbot shows us, he very much assuaged himself in his defeat by sort of cultivating himself as a traditional Indic in an Indic manner. His successor, Bodh Singh of Bundi, was again appointed by Akbar to continue to command the Chunar fort. And Bodh Singh was often away, so he left his son Ratan Singh, whose portrait we see above, in charge of Chunar. Now, what's significant about this is that in 1591, we have another Ragamala that's produced, known as, it's known famously as the Chunar Ragamala. Now, we know that the patron was either Ratan Singh or Bodh Singh, but definitely one of these two gentlemen from Bundi had commissioned this Ragamala. We also know from what's written on the back of one of the pages that the artists engaged were three artists, Sheikh Hatim, Sheikh Ali, and Sheikh Hussein, who had been trained by the famous painters Mir Said Ali and Abdus Samad. That is, those two artists, among others, who have been brought by Humayun from the Safavid court to now train artists and work themselves in the Mughal court. So again, we're seeing this remarkable sharing of traditions. Pages, the traditional oblong format of the traditional Indic manuscript is now made vertical, as it would be in any Mughal manuscript. We see, I'm not going to describe this too much, but we see a delineation of figures that are modeled, that are not just flat, so on and so forth. And this begins really is the seeds of the beginning of Rajput painting, which has become so heavily influenced by the Mughal work. But again, these are traditions that are being shared as we can see them here. Another remarkable patron is, of course, Toder Mal, who served Akbar very well. And we know that he rebuilt, we should say, the famous Vishwanath temple in Benares, of which had been damaged or destroyed by Aurangzeb, and then incorporated into the Gyan Vapi Mosque. But enough of the temple survives, and I'm showing you two images from, my God, they must be probably from the 70s, because you cannot get even close to this structure anymore. But if you look at them, you can see, for example, the cusped arches, the Tirana type details, which are typical of an Akbari style that we can see in this temple. Among the notable patrons under Akbar, and I'll pretty much finish with Rajaman Singh, is Rajaman Singh, who lives from 1550 to 1614. Rajaman Singh, as I'm sure you know, is the ruler of Amber, that is a Rajput vassal state. But at the same time, he becomes the highest ranking officer in the Mughal administrative system, other than the imperial princes. And we have at least two biographies that are written about Rajaman Singh. Rajaman Singh's patronage, which is basically architectural, is quite extraordinary. It ranges from basically what's today Pakistan into what is today Bengal. It has a huge variety, as I'll show you. His first work that we really know much about was a garden that he built when he was still a prince, before he became a Raja, when his father was still alive, at a place that becomes known as Wa, which is near the ancient Buddhist site of Taxila, just to give you an idea of where it is, and the modern capital of Islamabad, of Pakistan. This garden that he built is over a natural spring. It becomes enlarged in the later Mughal period. The Mughals were quite keen on Man Singh's Wa garden. As you can see, it's built in the foothills, and it stands against hills and greeneries. The waters are crystal clear even today. And Jahangir, who was not too enthusiastic at all about Man Singh, adored Wa. He thought Wa was a perfect Mughal garden. And he even put pearls in the noses of the fish that swam in its water. While the descendants of this fish, which I think you can see in this picture, no longer have pearls, you still see that the water is crystal clear. Now, Jahangir saw it as a perfect Mughal garden. But I'd like to think about what Man Singh might have thought about this garden. And that is that this garden is in the hills, in the greenery, in the waters, and that is in the Hindu tradition, the abode of the deities, the abode of the gods. And so it seems to me that perhaps Man Singh saw this garden in two ways. In one way is that perfect pleasure garden, and in the other way as perhaps the abode of the gods. Man Singh, just to show you the garden again, Man Singh, as I said, built an enormous range of materials. And we know that he had built with his father a mosque in Lahore, which is no longer extant. We know he supported a Sufi shrine in Hajipur, that is in Bihar. But he also built, after he became governor of Bengal, a mosque on the banks of the Ganges. Today, a Jami Mosque. He built this around 1595 or so at Rajmahal, which then was Bengal, became Bihar, and now is Jharkhand. The mosque is a very large mosque. I'm sorry, and you can see, just to get an idea of its setting of how it would have been highly visible. This is a painting by Sitaram of the mosque, showing you that, again, it would have been a large, imposing structure. And if we look at the mosque, it's two things. Let me just go back for a minute. This mosque is built at a time when controlling Bengal is extremely difficult. Then there are Afghan rebels who are subverting Mughal authority there. These are Afghan rebels who had served once in Akbar's court, but now are rebelling. So Man Singh builds this mosque, and he builds it, if we look at the plans, in a manner similar to the great mosque at Fatehpur Sikri. The mosque at Fatehpur Sikri, I agree, is more complex, but remember, we're in the hinterlands here. But we can see that the plan with its double-aisled and large single area with its galleries on either side is basically similar. If we look at a drawing by Buchanan and Hamilton done in the very early 19th century, and if we look at the mosque at Fatehpur Sikri, we can see that the great ruined mosque at Rajmahal originally had inlay, probably painted plaster, to look like that red and white sandstone of the mosque at Fatehpur Sikri. This mosque was built as an imperial message. It was meant to say that Mughal authority is here in the hinterlands. It was meant to perhaps not share Mughal tradition, but to impose Mughal tradition. While Man Singh built an enormous number of types of structures, perhaps he built more temples than anything else. A number of his temples are commemorative. One is the temple that he built over his father's, the site of Shraddha rites for his father. He built a Surya temple outside of Gaya, which of course is the place where all Shraddha rites are imposed, propitiated. Surya temples are quite unusual. He probably built this Surya temple for two reasons. One would be to underscore that his lineage is a Surya Vamsha one, and the other is perhaps to evoke one of the few Surya temples that we have in North India that stand in Amber, the capital of the Kachwahas, that is Raja Man Singh's lineage. He also built a Shiva temple over the site of his mother's cremation spot in a place called Vaikatpur, which is on the Ganges in Bihar. Actually, it's not on the Ganges anymore. The Ganges is shifted, but originally it was on the site of the Ganges. The Vaikatpur temple is a commemorative temple, but it's more than that. It's also a temple to Mughal victory. Raja Man Singh had a dream that a Shivalinga this is a little complicated. I'm sorry. He had a dream that and as a result of a dream, he discovered a amulet that was associated with the demon king of Magadha. Its loss in mythic lore had allowed Bhima to kill this demon king. Raja Man Singh, upon discovering it and then enshrining it in this temple, gave him a military victory. So we have commemorative temples that also celebrate Mughal victories. So what we're seeing with these temples, and not every one of them, but some of them, where we have a conflation, a sharing of family Kachwaha tradition and Mughal victory. His most famous temple for sure is the one that he built, that is the Govinda Deva temple at Vrindavan, which he built, or at least started in 1590. The temple is enormous. It's about 80 meters long. It's impossible to get a decent photograph. This is a very old photograph, but you could not get this image today because of the encroachment around it. As you can see, it's built in the imperial red Mughal Sanskrit, Mughal red imperial idiom of red sandstone. And of course, we know that his choice of Vrindavan is directly related to Akbar's interest in Vrindavan. Akbar, as we know, supported temples there since 1565. And so by constructing this temple, again, he's playing into Akbar's policies of Sulay Kul. We also believe that Man Singh constructed this temple as a vow that he made when he was a prince, when he had a Mughal victory, when he was serving in the Punjab and in areas north. The temple is, as I said, enormous. It's the largest temple probably that had constructed since about maybe the 13th century in northern India. Its facade, its exterior follows a very Indic tradition. That is, it's built on what's called a trabeated or a post and lintel technique, which is traditional of Indian temples. But the interior, as you can see, is vaulted. In other words, it shares the traditions that we're seeing, for example, in the interiors of some of the tombs I've shown you, in the interior of Humayun's tomb, which I didn't show you, but I assume many of you do know. So again, we have this sharing of traditions. We have these Indic traditions, and then we have these Mughal traditions that we're seeing in this spectacular interior. Not only are we seeing shared traditions, we're seeing innovation. And again, this is something that is quite remarkable for where what we're seeing here with this interior dome is a way of building which has not been done before. It involves technology and engineering. This was acceptable in Mughal India. In contemporary courts, as let's say the Ottomans or the Safavids, no noble would dare surpass in patronage something then that would bypass what the ruler had done. So again, this shows a sort of level of tolerance in the Mughal court. In his own homeland, in his own Batan Jagir and Amber, he builds a large temple, not as large as the Govinda Deva, but large enough, which is known as the Jagat Shirmani. It is built in honor of his deceased heir apparent, his son Jagat Singh, who dies quite suddenly, who had served him well in many military expeditions. The temple is shown on the famous map of Amber, dated to 1711. You can see it in the lower right-hand corner. And here you see the palace above it. And here I'm showing you a detail. You can see that the temple is prominent. Okay, so you get an idea that by including this temple on this map in such a prominent manner, that this temple was of great importance to the Kachwas. If you look at the temple from above, that is from the palace above, you can see that the shikara is a pretty traditional shikara. Excuse me, I need a little glass of water. It looks like a typical temple shikara of North India. It follows a very traditional format. It's entered by an elaborate marble torana. And note the two huge flanking elephants that we see at the temple entrance. Now, elephants are very commonly depicted on the base of Hindu temples from very early on. But it's really with this temple, as far as I know, that you start seeing large size elephants at the temple entrance. And we could well imagine that this is possibly inspired by Akbar's love of elephants, by his elephants at, let's say, Fatehpur Sikri. I'll go back into that later. And elephants, again, are an imperial symbol. So we see Man Singh here projecting his image as the ruler, the Raja of his own territory. The front of the temple is very different from the back of the temple. And I want to say here that it's very clear this temple was built in a single campaign. Okay, I don't want you to think it was built in 2 installments. It's very clear from looking at it carefully that it's a single campaign. While the back of the temple, from the back of the shikara, is very traditional, the front of the temple borrows many Mughal elements, or maybe I should say shares many Mughal elements. A case in point are the little blind niches that you see on the facade. And here I'm comparing it to one of the niches on the Jahangiri Mahal at on the Agra fort that you can see here, and you can see their similarity. The entrance, and I'm sorry, this is such a bad image, as you can see, comes right out of that pan-Indian tradition that we talked about earlier at the beginning of this talk. Some of the imagery on the temple, though, is quite unique. And here in the detail, and I hope you can see this, is an image of Vamana, that is the dwarf form of Vishnu, who, if you remember, is going to stride the entire world in 3 steps. But he's never shown as Trivikrama, that is that form of Vishnu that strides the world. His potential is not yet realized. Recalling the recent death of Jagat Singh, Man Singh's heir apparent. So again, there's both something extremely personal and commemorative in this temple, but also something that reflects the larger Mughal cultural milieu of which this structure comes out of. Man Singh built mansions, one of which is Haveli in Amber, which I'm not showing you except for that painting. Another is this Mandir in Benares, which is in the part that's painted kind of cream is later intrusion. But you can see that the sides of it have the typical sort of Akbari Jarokas that we have. He also built a water pavilion in Bairat in Rajasthan, which was a major stopping point on crossroads between Amber and the Mughal capitals. Today, the whole water pavilion part is not evident, but as you can see, it's very similar to the water pavilion that we saw in Narnaul, which is also, as you recall, very similar to what we saw at Fatehpur Sikri. So again, this using the imperial style, sharing the imperial style in the hinterlands to give this message of Mughal authority being closely linked to Akbar's policy of Sulekho. Rajaman Singh's palace at Rohtas in Bihar is the largest surviving and perhaps even the largest ever sub-imperial palace that was built. It was built again over an extended period of time between 1590 and 1610. It is in Bihar in what is now Rohtas district on the top of this hill that I show you in this picture. Just to give you an idea of the scale and scope, you see an aerial view here, and then you can see the plan. The only part of the temple that I'm going to really be talking about is the sort of that long facade that you can see. You can see that there's a kind of courtyard in front of it. That would have been a public audience hall, okay? And in other words, this area and that you can see in this courtyard, so now without a pointer to show it to you. And here we see 2 things that are notable. We can see that there are Jarokas. We know that basically the use of the Jaroka was forbidden by governors and nobles. But we do know from sources that somehow the Kachwahas, that is the rulers of Amber, were allowed the use of the Jaroka, which is something interesting. And we also, and you can just see this is a little closer here, and here's some very old pictures showing you before they whitewashed it. But we also are going to look at this entrance gate. Now, the entrance gate into the entire complex, as you can see, is flanked with elephants on either side of the entrance gate. And we saw elephants at the Jagat Shiromani in Amber at that temple. We also see them here, and as I suggested, I suspect that they're inspired by the elephant gate that we have Fatehpur Sikri. So again, what we're doing here is we're taking elements from the capital and we're using them in the hinterland to share, I guess you might want to think of it as, the notion of Mughal authority as it's spread uniformly throughout the lands. When you go through the entrance gate, on the other side of this entrance gate are a panel of inscriptions. There's 2 inscriptions, and I know you can't really see them in this image, and there is no way for me to get a better picture of it than this right now. The 2 inscriptions are right above the arched opened doorway. One of these inscriptions is in Persian, and that inscription in Persian suggests that Akbar built this palace as, I'm sorry, I was speaking, that Rajaman Singh built this palace as the servant of Akbar. For it extensively and first addresses Akbar as the emperor. And there's one brief reference to Rajaman Singh himself, who was the actual patron. But in the much longer Sanskrit inscription, which is next to it, we have a rather different message that we have. Here, we have Rajaman Singh inserting himself as his own authority as the head of the Kachwaha house. He doesn't even mention Akbar in the Sanskrit inscription, but instead he mentions himself at least twice, and he doesn't use his Mughal title of Raja, but rather he identifies himself as Sri Maharaja Adiraja Maharaja. In other words, he's giving himself a very distinguished title. We might think that this inflated title on the palace intended to serve both the governor's needs as well as those of the state, it underscores the dualistic nature of the relationship between the Raja and the Mughal emperor. Under the Mughal state system, serving the emperor included defending one's own religion, honor, and even patrimony if necessary. So this title it symbolizes Rajput ideals and aspirations, but it doesn't conflict with his role as Akbar's governor, for both basically are integral to the success of the Mughal state, something again, which is unique to the Mughals. You would never find this under the Ottomans or the Safavids. So what we have here is certainly with the patronage of Aga Khan and with Rajaman Singh, are shared traditions, but shared traditions that basically are being aimed at upholding and promoting Akbar's policy of Sulai Kul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Asher, for a very illuminating lecture. I think there would be a number of queries which probably you would like to answer. I would just read out some of the questions which have been put up by those who have been listening into the lecture. There's a question by Chandrasekhar Tampi. To what extent does Akbar's own aesthetic sense influence or determine the construction of edifices by his nobility. The influence of Akbar himself on the construction and edifices by his nobility. That is what the
Okay, am I
question is.
am I unmuted now? I think it's very clear that certainly to some extent, or even to some large extent, that the construction under the nobles is very much influenced by what's been done in the center. I think a case in point was the fact that the two Jal Mahals or Water Mahal pavilions that we saw were very much based on the appearance of the Diwan-e-Khas at Fatehpur Sikri. They're not just simply, they're inspired by them, but the interiors, for example, are quite different. So I think what we see is a reliance on what we see at the center. And I suspect that this is quite intentional, for it's a way to show visually Mughal presence and Mughal authority. It's also a way for these nobles to say that I'm part of this current sophisticated culture. So I think it works two ways. On one hand, it disseminates the imperial Mughal message, but on the other hand, it shows that these nobles are part of that culture. They belong to it. They are, they are included, so to speak. So I think it works both ways. But certainly, I don't think they're slavish. For example, the Vrindavan temple or the Jagat Shirmani, and I only showed you a little bit of the Jagat Shirmani, are hardly anything that Akbar is going to build. He might give money to support the lands, the temples, but he's not going to build anything himself. And so what Man Singh or Toder Mal or whoever is building these temples is doing, they're using elements found at the center, but they're doing it in their own innovative manner. So I think we can't see this as being slavish, but an opportunity both to promote Mughal ideology and a way to say, I'm part of it. I'm a player.
That would mean, Professor Asher, that you would not agree with what Stephen Blake had once called Mughals as the patrimonial bureaucratic empire. The emperor being the pater familias, and he is being followed by the nobility in toto. So you won't agree with that.
I'm not sure I really disagree, but I think people are allowed to have their own level of creativity, just like Man Singh is allowed to assert himself in his Sanskrit inscription as Raja Adiraja. I don't think for 1 minute that he's worried that Akbar is going to find out about it. Because these guys, there's no secrets. They know what's going on. I think they're, certainly I think they are part of a patrimonial, I think they are part of this a bureaucratic system that's patrimonial. But I also think that there is room for flexibility, and especially in the arts. So I don't know, I'm not sure how that argument would work with the arts, but I do think that there's flexibility.
Right. There is another question by Miss Lubna Irfan. She asks the possible conflict and tussle that must have existed between the royalty and the nobility, and the role of architectural activities in such frictions.
Well, It's a good question. I really, actually, I'm sure there were frictions. I have no doubt about it. But I'm not really too sure that, I mean, the kind of frictions that we see are later frictions. For example, when the Sisodia ruler is not supposed to rebuild the walls of Chittor and he goes ahead and do it. But I mean, the very fact that Jahangir in 1605 issues orders for the nobles to build in the hinterlands, so that we have the idea of building in the hinterlands is to ensure that we have basic civilization, that we don't have sort of marauders and riots, that we have urban settlement. So it seems to me that basically it's in the best interests of the emperors to have architectural construction, as long as it isn't construction that means that you're building a fort against, if you're building defenses against the Mughals, obviously that's not acceptable, as we have in the case of Chittor. But if we're settling the lands, if we're giving public works, if we're building bridges, if we're building wells, if we're building hammams, this is a public service. Obviously, the state can't do it all. And it seems to me that the conflict would be more if they didn't do it, as opposed to if they do it. That would be my take on that.
There is another question by Chandrasekhar Tampi. There is a Mughal era monument at Mehroli that later came to be known as Dilkusha. You were skeptical about the patronage of the noble to whom it is attributed. Could you elaborate upon it?
I'm trying to remember. That was in my Kutub book. It was attributed to, help, I've forgotten the name. But the reason I'm skeptical of it is that we have no Mughal source that gives that as the name of the patron. And I'm sorry, I was in a different century when I was giving this talk than that question. It's possible that it was, but you see, the land was sold to Metcalfe, and it was sold to him on the grounds that Sir Thomas Metcalfe, it was sold to him on the grounds that it had been owned originally by this very high-ranking noble, probably to elevate the property value. But we have, and it might have been that guy, but we have no inscriptional evidence. We have no textual evidence. So we don't know. That's all I'm trying to say. Not that I was, and this is for you, the rest of you in this talk, this is not what I was just talking about. So you know. But anyway, what my point was, and that unless you have some sort of evidence, and it seemed to me we don't have any evidence, and I'd have to really go back and look at what I said exactly right now. But that just word of mouth, especially when someone's trying to enhance the value of the property, you might want to be a bit skeptical about it.
Right. There is another question by Dr. Salim Javed. He is from Kolkata. He asked about that there are two types of temples which were constructed.
I'm sorry.
The Jagat Shiromani temple. Jagat Shiromani temple was constructed in the Nagara style, whereas in the Jaipur you have the Haveli style. So how would you define why this difference occurred?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you look at the Haveli style temples of Jaipur are later than the ones that we're talking about. If you go to Amber, you'll see any number of temples in that a more traditional Nagara style. The Haveli style temples don't start until the 18th century. And so we're talking about a rather large time difference there.
Well, there is a question again by Lubna Irfan. Can public architectural endeavors also be looked at as means of power assertion?
Why not? I mean, yes. I mean, people are going to spend money in part to be generous, but you know, they want their name attached to it. That's why they stick inscriptions on it. And so that, you know, that certainly does, that gives them a power basis. I mean, Donald Trump, unfortunately, goes around building a bunch of towers and puts his name on it. It's supposed to make him look important. Yes, I'm not trying to suggest it's just simply charitable. Maybe I went overboard on that. But obviously, there's an assertion of power and authority. And I mean, part of that power and authority is to say that the state is powerful. But then the next step of that is to say that I'm a powerful player in a powerful state. So I don't think that they contradict each other, those two ideas. Does that help?
Yeah, Professor Asher, I would like to ask you two basic questions. One an extension to what Lubna just asked. You know, as you rightly pointed out, that the nobles made a number of public structures. They invested their money, and at various places, public structures came up. Now, you have studied architecture so widely. When you have looked at the imperial architecture, you have looked at the contribution of the nobles. My question is that if you try to compare the endeavor of the nobles, what do you find? Whether they contributed more to public structures or to religious structures? I mean, if you try to quantify, were they investing more?
You know, it's a really good question, and part of the problem is what survives. Okay, and also I think different periods. For example, in Akbar's period, I would say offhand, and again, I would probably need to look at extant inscriptions where buildings don't necessarily survive. Certainly, it seems that of the high-ranking nobles, the Hindus are building temples, but I'm not seeing that many of the Muslims necessarily building religious structures. I'm thinking this out loud. I don't have a set answer. Akbar is not. He builds the great mosque at Fatehpur Sikri and at the mosque at Ajmer in the Dargah. Other than that, he's not really a particularly active patron of religious architecture. He certainly gives money to shrines and things, but he's not necessarily building a lot of stuff at them.
Right.
And that's probably the model that the nobles are following, who are Muslims. But if we move into later times, especially if we get into the later Mughals, where the rulers themselves are very, they're not building much themselves, find a huge number of religious structures. So I think your question is a great one, and it's not something I've really kind of seriously thought about, or you know, in a systematic way. But I do think you are not going to find a universal answer, a single universal answer across the entire chronology. I think you're going to have to look at different periods, different religious trends, so on and so forth. And I think the other problem is that public works are heavily used. They're functional. They're often roads or bridges or wells that need a lot of maintenance. They don't, and wells, of course, nobody uses wells much anymore. They have tube wells. I mean, there's so many mogul bowlies and wells that are been damaged or have been covered over. So it's kind of hard to really say. I think you'd have to think about it in an extremely systematic manner. But I would say in the period of Akbar that except for temples, there's not really that much religious construction that's going on, it would seem.
Right. I mean, that is, I feel that this is one of the topics on which more research is, needed to answer this question.
We would have to go through inscriptions because we have so many inscriptions of monuments that are no longer extant.
Right.
And of course, the Epigraphica India and the annual report on Indian epigraphy is a great help there, if anyone wants to actually wade through it.
Right. Now, there is another query. I'm sorry, ma'am, it's you must be tired, but every day we don't get an opportunity to listen to you and get our queries answered. Every one of us knows about Abdur Rahim Khan Khanan and his atelier. You also mentioned the atelier in which a number of manuscripts were prepared. I mean, his architectural endeavors you talked about. Were there any other such major ateliers by the nobles during the period of Akbar, apart from Abdur Rahim Khan Khanan, or was he a unique?
I keep wondering about. I don't know the answer, and I wish I did, but it's hard for me to believe that there weren't other ones. Although we do know that some nobles bought manuscripts that were painted for the open market. You'd have to have an atelier like the one that Abdur Rahman had. You'd have to have extraordinary wealth, and so I think the two nobles I was really looking at are both brought up in the Mughal household. And so I think they have a unique position. I think that's why Man Singh can build more than any other noble ever did. And I think that's why we have a unique atelier with the Khan Khanan. Certainly we see later in the 17th and 18th centuries these amazing ateliers that develop in the various Rajput courts.
Yes.
I just think there's a lot of work that has to be done on these nobles, and I'm always surprised that more people haven't had a big interest in them. I suspect we'll find things, but at the moment I can't give you a name.
Right, ma'am. Professor, thanks a lot. I don't think we have other very relevant questions, so I would actually thank Professor Ashraf. And one of the things which I would carry from this lecture is the fact which you told us about the messages which the Persian and non-Persian inscription by the same person on the same structure is trying to give. I mean, that talks about the patron-client relationship as well, that when he is writing in Persian, so he is much more subservient to his emperor. I mean, trying to posture himself as one of the obedient nobles. And when he is giving a non-Persian inscription, when he is talking to his own people, as you rightly pointed out, that he's not even mentioning the name of the emperor, what to talk about praising him, and then he's giving his own titles which are quite bombastic. Thank you, Professor Asher. That really tells us the story, what actually was the relationship between those nobles and the emperor. I must thank Ganga Jamni and thank you both for this lecture. I hope the people listening to it and those who will listen to it in future, because we are going to upload it on the YouTube, they would benefit from it. I would, in the end, just remind the people out there that these lecture series would continue for a long time to come. And I would expect that you people would be joining us again and again on Fridays and on Sundays. Uh, uh, the next week, we would have, as I said, two lectures, one on Friday, which would be on the sources of the for the study of the Mughal Empire, and on the Sundays we would be having lectures on our shared past. In the shared past, we would be having Dr. Catherine Schofield, who would be discussing aspects of music, the give and take which took place during the Mughal period, as far as the music traditions were concerned. In fact, she would be telling us about the what actually Mughal music was. And if everything goes well, then on Friday, I'm sorry that I keep on appearing again and again, but I would be taking up and delivering a lecture on two very important sources, early Mughal, early medieval sources. One, Kitabul Hind of Al-Biruni, what information it gives for India, and second, Amir Khusro, especially his No Sepeher, and what idea of India he tries to put forward to us. With these words, thank you very much, and let us join the next week. Thank you, Professor Aisha. Shagufta? Shagufta?
Thank you. I'd like to thank, I have a bad throat today, but I'd like to thank Professor Asher. It was brilliant. It was illuminating. It's such a joy to hear you after so many years again. And thank you, Professor Asher. And thank you again, Professor Rezavi, for this wonderful series that we started on Fridays and Sundays. And we look forward to more experts and more scholarly talks happening on Ganga Jamni and Asha. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank
Night.
you, everybody. Bye bye. Namaskar.